Welcome back to my channel. Welcome to the Truth Teller's Mic. We're going to be speaking and giving you the background on Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. She was a psychiatrist, an educator, author, and is best known for the ISIS papers and her theory of color, confrontation, and racism. Frances Luella Cress Welsing. She was born on March 18, 1935. She was born in Chicago, Illinois. She was raised in a middle-class African-American family where her father was a psychologist and her mother was a teacher. This family background exposed her to early intellectual discussions about psychology, race, and society. She was educated at the University of Illinois, where she received her bachelor's degree in psychology. She received her graduate degree, which was a master's, and later a medical degree from Howard University, located in Washington, D.C. The additional training she completed was her residency in psychiatry, and she also engaged in extensive research on societal structures, racism, or racial dynamics in psychology. Her education was both clinical and theoretical, grounding her work in rigorous psychological and medical principles, but with a strong focus on social and cultural contexts. She practiced psychiatry. She had a private practice. She focused on both individual therapy and community mental health. She was also a consultant and lecturer. She worked in schools and prisons and community organizations, offering insight into racial tensions, family dynamics, and systemic oppression. She was an educator. She served as an adjunct professor and lecturer at various institutions, particularly on subjects related to race, psychology, and social injustice. She was known for speaking publicly about racism, white supremacy, and their psychological effects on Black people. She had a few major works. One is the ISIS papers. Now, the ISIS papers, The Keys to the Colors, was published in 1991 and revised in 2011. This was her most famous work. It consisted of a collection of essays examining the origin of racism, white supremacy, and the social, psychological, and biological dimensions of racial oppression. Introduces the Cress Welsing color-confrontation theory, which posits that white supremacy and systemic racism are rooted in fear of genetic annihilation by people of color, particularly Black people. And she further explores the global historical oppression from media manipulation and social control systems. She had numerous articles and papers on psychiatry, family dynamics, and systemic racism. And she was contributed in conferences and workshops about Black empowerment and psychology. The color confrontation theory argues that racism and white supremacy are primarily psychological responses to whites, to the genetic and biological differences of Black people. It also suggests that the systemic oppression, violence, and social manipulation are tools to maintain dominance. When focusing on genetics, she emphasized that the survival of the Black gene pool was perceived as a threat by white-dominated societies, influencing global historical oppression. Now, the psychological impact of racism, she studied the effects of racism on the mental health of Black communities and highlighted the importance of understanding historical trauma and intergenerational oppression. She was famously recognized primarily for the ISIS papers and her theory on systemic racism. Frequently, she's cited in her discussions of Black empowerment, psychology, and social justice. She was recognized for being bold in connecting psychology, genetics, and societal power structures, often sparking controversy. Now, there were some controversies and challenges that she experienced. She received criticism from some scholars who dismissed her theories as speculative and conspiratorial. There was pushback on her emphasis on genetics, and racial confrontation challenged mainstream narratives on equality, earning skepticism in academic circles. Her legacy, despite the criticism, her work remains influential in Black studies, Afrocentric scholarship, and discussions on systemic racism. Her legacy was on Black study programs, community empowerment workshops, and conversations about systemic oppression. She inspired activists, scholars, and educators to explore the psychological and social roots of racism. She remembered as a courageous thinker who refused to shy away from examining the uncomfortable truths of race and power. I meant to say she was remembered. She was remembered. Now, she also approach racial issues from medical and psychological angles, right? And her major works were the books of the ISIS Papers, The Keys of Color. The Keys of Color is the subtitle in 1991. She had essays on race, oppression, and the psychology of dominance. And the impact of her work challenged conventional ideas about race and influenced discussions on systemic racism and Black empowerment. She had a broad audience, a broad public audience of activists, educators, and urban communities. Her controversy was how she criticized she was criticized as being quite speculative and conspiratorial and confrontational in her style of delivery. Her legacy has inspired Black empowerment and discussions of systemic racism. She focused on Black empowerment, and that aimed to provide tools for understanding and resisting systemic oppression. She also had an interdisciplinary approach, where she blends psychology and history. And also she challenged mainstream narratives because she questioned dominant cultural perspectives, right, on race and genetics. And she sought to educate the Black community to understand societal forces and cultural heritage. Her work had a long-lasting and multifaceted impact on society, especially in discussions about race, systemic oppression, and Black empowerment. Here's what I'm going to present to you is her contributions and their benefits to the community, because she raised awareness about systemic racism. In her color-confrontation theory, she explained that racism not as a random prejudice, but it was a structured system that was rooted in fear and power dynamics. And it had an impact. Her color confrontation theory had an impact, and it helped individuals and communities and educators understand why racism persists across generations. Her work also provided a framework for analyzing historical and contemporary events, including police brutality, economic inequality, and cultural marginalization. Her work also emphasized that understanding oppression is the first step towards empowerment. And that encouraged self-awareness and pride in Black identity, stressing that Black people have historically been systematically suppressed, not inherently inferior. She also offered strategies for psychological resilience in the face of systemic oppression. She taught these strategies in workshops and seminars and Afrocentric educational programs. Though her work was controversial, her work has influenced Black studies, Africana studies, and psychology courses. And it had an impact because scholars reference her work to discuss the psychology of racism, intergenerational trauma, and systemic oppression. And it also provides a lens for understanding power dynamics, societal control, and social engineering in multiracial societies. Her theories have been widely cited in books, documentaries, interviews, and urban discourse. So she was able to shape conversations on race and media, hip-hop culture, and community activism. She encouraged cultural productions in music, theater, film that highlighted systemic racism or celebrate Black resilience. By framing racism as a psychological and systemic issue, her work motivates collective action rather than individual blame. And this supports movements like Black Lives Matter and grassroots community organizations. She provided historical and psychological evidence that policy reform, education, and social change are necessary to address oppression. And her work helps people understand how internalized oppression affects mental health and self-esteem. So individuals can recognize patterns of oppression and psychological manipulation in order to reduce self-blame. And these strategies for mental resilience and fostering strong cultural identity were very impactful in the Black communities. Her work is being used in education, in courses, workshops, lectures on race, psychology, and history. It is informing activists of strategies for advocacy, empowerment, and social justice. In media and arts, she has inspired literature, music, documentaries, and discussions on systemic racism. And in therapy and counseling, she has influenced the addressing of intergenerational trauma and fostering racial pride. She was cited in research on racism, societal power structures, and Afrocentric studies. The impact of her work has transformed how people understand racism, moving the focus from individual prejudice to systemic power and psychological dynamics. It equips both individuals and communities with knowledge, awareness, and tools to resist oppression and cultivate pride, resilience, and empowerment. Her early work in the 1970s as a practicing psychiatrist, she was lecturing and consulting in schools and communities. Her focus was on observing the psychological impact of racism on Black individuals and families. The impact was observed in her early workshops and lectures because it helped urban communities recognize systemic oppression and psychological manipulation. So her work was able to be used. Her ideas began circulating informally in community groups, emphasizing racial pride and awareness of societal control. She published essays and gave public lectures on racism, white supremacy, and systemic oppression. And so she contributed by developing and refining color-confrontation theory because its impact influenced African-American educators, activists, and community leaders. And it also sparked discussions in Black publications and radio shows about the structural causes of racism. Schools and community programs began incorporating her theories into workshops and seminars for youth empowerment. And the list goes on. In 1991, that was the publication of the publication of the ISIS papers. Now, it brought her theories to a national and international audience. It made the connection between genetics, psychology, and systemic racism being accessible to both scholars and the general public. It was used in university courses in Black studies and psychology. It was referenced in activist circles to educate about systemic oppression, and it inspired cultural discussions in media, music, and literature about race and empowerment. She encouraged a broader understanding of intergenerational trauma that is caused by systemic racism. And activists and educators used her frameworks and youth mentorship programs, as well as her works was cited in documentaries and interviews and publications about race in America. Her ongoing legacy, her writings are studied internationally in African and African American studies. And it has a cultural influence because it continues to influence Black literature, hip hop, visual arts, and social commentary. And her work is used as an empowerment tool. Her work serves as a psychological and historical map for understanding racism and building resilience. There was backlash. There were controversial topics that sparked debate in her work. There was misunderstanding and gaslighting in the Black community. Now, the mainstream society, many of the scholars criticized her color confrontation theory as speculative and overly biological. Some even considered her work conspiratorial or unscientific because it connects genetic psychology and systemic oppression. The media also began a pushback because Welsing had bold claims about white supremacy, genetic fears, and global oppression, and it often drew negative media attention. So mainstream outlets sometimes dismissed her as radical rather than engaging with her ideas seriously. The reason for the backlash was her work directly challenged dominant narratives about racial equality and social harmony, and that exposed uncomfortable truths about power, oppression, and historical manipulation. Now, the misunderstanding and gaslighting in the Black community, it was quite complex because her theories involved genetics, psychology, and systemic oppression, which was challenging to be understood without full context, right? So someone would have to invest time in getting to know her studies, familiarizing themselves with her studies, with her work. And some Black individuals were told her ideas were too extreme or divisive, leading to dismissal or internal doubt. In some cases, her warnings about systemic oppression were minimized or ignored, causing confusion or internalized skepticism in the Black community. And there were forms of gaslighting because being told that racism is just personal prejudice rather than systemic, despite the evidence, was a form of gaslighting. To say that it's a one-on-one interaction. It has nothing to do with any shadows, any groups that have built systemically off of racism in order to have a certain class of people oppressed. Now, the gaslighting dismissed Black resilience as individual effort rather than understanding the structural forces she described. And also, it was encouraging Black people to ignore her work and just move on. Move past the racism rather than confront its psychological and societal roots, which runs counter to Welsing's core message. Now, white supremacy, she labeled as a global system. She framed racism as systemic and fear-based, which some interpreted as extreme. Now, she also linked the oppression to genetic fears of the survival of the Black race, which made some scholars uncomfortable and sparked accusations of pseudoscience. But activists had to navigate her theories carefully in public spaces, balancing education with potential backlash. Even if they understood that it was true or it was some validity to it, they had to be careful how they came out publicly and mentored and lectured and developed workshops and teaching materials. Because the long-term impact, despite the backlash she received, her work gained validation over time. Modern research on systemic racism, intergenerational trauma, and social psychology aligns with many of her observations. And there is empowerment through awareness. Even with controversy, her work has empowered Black communities to analyze societal structures critically. And she worked and she saw things through a critical lens. Her work encouraged critical thinking about media, history, and politics, helping communities resist manipulated or being gaslit by dominant narratives. Yes, she did receive academic backlash. Some scholars in psychology and sociology criticized her theory, her color-confrontation theory. It was dismissed as being speculative and unscientific. The claim was linking white supremacy to a genetic fear of Black survival was biologically deterministic and therefore controversial. Now, what was this effect? This led to her work being excluded from mainstream academic curriculum, right, for decades, limiting formal scholarly recognition. And the gaslighting effect was received by Black students and academics because they were sometimes told that exploring systemic racism in this way was too radical or unrealistic in order to create doubt about the legitimacy of her observations. She's responsible for explaining the mechanics of systemic racism, empowering Black communities psychologically and culturally, influencing academic scholarship and Afrocentric studies, inspiring media, literature, and cultural expression. Also supporting activism and social justice movements, while encouraging critical thinking and awareness of societal power structures. The bottom line is this: her work provides the intellectual, the psychological, and cultural tools for understanding oppression, fostering empowerment, and driving social change. I hope you've enjoyed this work. This is just a small piece of who she is and what she contributed to the Black community and to society, to the academia, and also in psychology. Thank you for listening, and see you on the next one.